Close your eyes. Hear that sound. It's a distant metallic clang, the echo of 1,200 men yelling, a sound swallowed by concrete and razor wire. This is Attica. Not just a prison, but a pressure cooker of racism, neglect, and brutality that was about to explode. On a crisp September morning in 1971, the lid blew off. For 4 days, these men, mostly black and Puerto Rican, held a piece of America hostage, demanding to be treated like human beings. What happened inside the walls of Attica, New York, during that terrible week is a raw, unforgiving look at how hope can turn into horror and how the state can respond to a cry for justice with absolute, deadly force. This is the true story of the Attica Prison Uprising, America's most violent prison revolt. Let's set the scene. Attica Correctional Facility, 1971. If you pictured a stone fortress from a movie, you'd be pretty close. Built almost a century before, Attica was old, dark, and designed to crush the spirit. The men inside were overwhelmingly black and Puerto Rican, coming from the poorest parts of New York City. The guards, on the other hand, were almost entirely white, recruited from the small, conservative towns surrounding the prison. This wasn't just a prison. It was a cultural and racial fault line, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a shank. The conditions were straight up inhumane. We're talking about one roll of toilet paper a month. Showers once a week, if you were lucky. The food? Imagine the worst, grayest slop you've ever seen. And that was a good day. It was barely edible. Medical care was a joke. A serious illness meant a bottle of aspirin and a shrug. But the absolute worst part, the fuel that kept the fire burning, was the attitude of the guards. They called the inmates by racial slurs. They used physical force constantly. It wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about control through humiliation and fear. Now, outside the walls, the country was in turmoil. The civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-war protests, all that energy was filtering through the mail and the few allowed books and magazines. The men inside were reading about their rights, about people standing up and demanding change. They were starting to talk, to organize, to realize their shared misery wasn't just bad luck, it was systemic. They wrote letters to the commissioner, to the governor, begging for basic reforms, better food, fair treatment, a chance to learn a trade. Their pleas were ignored. Every single one. The message from the state was clear: shut up, sit down, and serve your time. This led to the formation of inmate committees, men who were articulate and smart, who tried to work within the system. But they hit a brick wall every time. When you ask nicely for dignity and you get spit back in your face, what's your next move? For the men of Attica, the feeling was that they had nothing left to lose. They were already living in a hell, and the only path out of the constant abuse seemed to be a radical, desperate act. They weren't planning a riot. They were planning a protest, a coordinated strike to bring attention to the injustice. But in a place like Attica, a simple protest could ignite into something much, much bigger. The pressure was building, day by day, hour by hour. All it needed was a spark. The morning of Thursday, September 9th, 1971, started like any other at Attica. But the day before, a small, minor incident set the stage for everything that followed. A couple of inmates had a scuffle with a guard, and the prison administration immediately threw them into isolation. This was a common punishment, but this time, it was the final indignity. The word spread through the blocks: they're taking our brothers. This fear, the arbitrary power of the guards to disappear anyone at any time, was the spark. At around 8:40 a.m., as the inmates were being marched to breakfast and work assignments, the line stopped in the tunnel between A block and the main yard. No one knows exactly who yelled the first command, but suddenly, the plan, or perhaps the desperate impulse, was on. Men broke ranks. They grabbed brooms, bats, whatever they could find. The goal was to take control of the central Times Square area, the intersection of the four main blocks, and the administrative offices. The takeover was swift and brutally effective. The guards were completely unprepared. They were used to compliance, not coordinated resistance. In a terrifying rush, inmates overwhelmed the few dozen guards on duty, using sheer numbers and the element of surprise. The first sound of the riot was the sound of a metal door being wrenched off its hinges, followed by screams. One guard, Officer William Quinn, was cornered and severely beaten. He later died from his injuries, becoming the first casualty of the revolt. Within minutes, the inmates had secured control of 4 of the 5 main cell blocks, A, B, C, and D, and the massive recreation yard in the center. The only area the state still controlled was the administrative building and the 5th cell block, E block, which housed the most aggressive isolation prisoners. But in D yard, the large, open-air recreation field, the prisoners gathered. They had taken 42 hostages, correctional officers, civilian employees, and a few maintenance workers. The men who had been treated like garbage were now holding the keys to the prison, and more importantly, they had the attention of the world. The chaos of the initial takeover quickly subsided, replaced by a strange, temporary calm in D yard. The rebellion was messy, violent, and desperate, but it was also organized. The men immediately set up an internal security force to protect the hostages and prevent infighting. They had done the impossible. They had taken Attica. The storm had broken. The first few hours in D yard were a whirlwind of adrenaline and organization. Imagine this, a huge, desolate concrete yard, suddenly transformed into a makeshift, independent community. The inmates took bedsheets, ropes, and blankets to create a perimeter and makeshift living quarters. They called it the free world. They placed the 42 hostages in a cluster in the center of the yard, guarding them closely. Crucially, the inmates made it clear to the world that they were not simply out for revenge, they were making a political stand. The first order of business was to draft a list of demands. These weren't wild, impossible claims. They were basic demands for human rights, adequate food, medical care, an end to physical abuse, religious freedom, and job training. They asked for amnesty from criminal prosecution for the takeover and for the chance to be transported to a non-imperialist country like Cuba or Algeria, a nod to the international revolutionary movements they admired. The leaders of the uprising quickly emerged. Men like L. D. Barkley, a charismatic and articulate inmate who became the primary spokesperson, and Frank Big Black Smith, a powerful man who took charge of the inmate security team, ensuring order and, critically, the safety of the hostages. Their presence and organization immediately put the lie to the official story being pushed by the state, that this was just a crazed riot of animals. The men had discipline and a clear purpose. As the word got out, the media descended on the prison, setting up camp outside the walls. Governor Nelson Rockefeller was immediately brought into the loop, as was the Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald. Oswald, in a move meant to show good faith, agreed to come to Attica. He initially went into the prison, but only as far as the administrative building, refusing to step into the yard itself. He listened to the demands, promised some minor concessions, but the inmates knew this wasn't enough. They demanded a public, written guarantee. To show the world they were serious and to legitimize their cause, the inmates demanded that a group of outside observers, lawyers, activists, and journalists, be brought in to mediate and witness the conditions and their demands firsthand. They wanted the world to see the truth. Commissioner Oswald agreed, and soon, a group of powerful, diverse, and well-known figures, including radical lawyer William Kunstler and New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, were assembled and brought to the gates. D Yard was no longer just a prison yard. It was a stage for a high-stakes drama, a negotiation for human dignity, with 42 lives hanging in the balance. The inmates held the power, but they knew that power was fleeting and the state was already mobilizing its forces. The arrival of the Citizens Observer Committee was a huge moment, not just for the inmates, but for the entire country watching the events unfold on television. This wasn't some backroom deal. This was a public negotiation witnessed by some of the most prominent and often radical figures of the era. The committee included lawyers, journalists, state assemblymen, and black activists. Men like Tom Wicker, a respected but somewhat establishment voice from the New York Times, found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with radical activists like Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panther Party. When the observers first walked into D Yard, they were stunned. They expected a scene of total anarchy, a place where blood was flowing and the hostages were being abused. Instead, they found a surprisingly disciplined camp. The inmates had designated leaders who spoke clearly and rationally. The hostages, while terrified, were being treated relatively well, sharing blankets and sometimes food with their captors. The inmates had taken great pains to show the world that this was not a criminal enterprise, but a legitimate political protest. The observer's role was incredibly difficult. They were trying to bridge a chasm between two worlds that absolutely hated and feared each other: the desperate, abused men in the yard, and the rigid, powerful state outside the walls, represented by Commissioner Oswald. The inmates, speaking through their elected delegates, read their demands, which now numbered 33, with unwavering intensity. They hammered home the core points: the need for better conditions, and, most critically, total amnesty. They feared, rightly, that if they surrendered, they would be massacred or spend the rest of their lives in solitary confinement. The negotiations were a grinding, agonizing process. Commissioner Oswald was willing to grant 28 of the 33 demands, mostly related to minor reforms like better food and male privileges. But on the 5 key issues, especially the demand for criminal amnesty and the request for Governor Rockefeller to personally come to the prison, Oswald held firm. He claimed he didn't have the authority to grant amnesty and that allowing the governor to come would be a dangerous precedent. This refusal was a huge roadblock. The inmates felt that without amnesty, the deal was worthless. Without Rockefeller, they had no guarantee the deal would hold up. The clock was ticking, and the tension in D-Yard was growing, amplified by the sound of state troopers and National Guard troops gathering outside the prison walls. Every man in that yard knew what the sight of those troops meant. As the negotiations stalled through the weekend, the focus of the state and the media began to shift almost entirely to the 42 hostages. The official narrative, fueled by the families of the guards and the state police, was that the hostages were facing immediate death and torture. The inmates, meanwhile, were doing everything they could to show the observers that the hostages were safe, knowing that the safety of these men was their only real bargaining chip. In D-Yard, the relationship between the captors and the captured was strange and complex. The inmates knew that harming a hostage meant the immediate end of the uprising and their own lives, so they assigned security details to protect them, often from other, less controlled inmates who harbored deep grudges against the correctional officers. Some guards even started talking with their captors, hearing the stories of abuse firsthand, perhaps understanding for the first time the desperation that fueled the revolt. But fear was a constant companion. The hostages were blindfolded for much of the time and forced to stand or sit in uncomfortable positions. It was a stressful situation for everyone. The state, however, began to circulate false and deeply inflammatory rumors that inmates had castrated some of the guards and that they were executing them one by one. These rumors were designed to turn public opinion against the inmates and create a moral justification for a violent assault. The observers inside D-Yard tried desperately to counteract this propaganda, issuing statements that the hostages were still alive, but the emotional narrative of the state was winning. This is where the role of Governor Nelson Rockefeller becomes central. From his office, he refused to come to Attica. Tom Wicker, the New York Times columnist, pleaded with him over the phone, arguing that Rockefeller's physical presence was the only way to save the hostages' lives and bring a peaceful end to the crisis. Rockefeller refused to give in to the hostage-takers' demands, viewing the act of his presence as a sign of weakness that would encourage future revolts. He believed that the principle of law and order, the idea that the state must never negotiate with those who commit violence, was more important than the lives of the men held captive. This decision, Rockefeller's refusal to appear, sealed the fate of the men in D-Yard. Without a credible authority to sign off on amnesty, the inmates had no reason to surrender, and the state had no reason left but force. By Monday morning, September 13th, the negotiations had reached a dead end. For days had passed since the takeover. The atmosphere in D-Yard had changed from determined hope to anxious fear. The inmates knew the state's patience was running out. They could hear the low rumble of helicopters and the heavy traffic of military vehicles outside the walls. They could smell the inevitable. Commissioner Oswald, under immense pressure from the governor's office, delivered a final ultimatum: surrender immediately and release the hostages, or face an assault. The inmates were given an impossible choice. Surrender without amnesty meant guaranteed torture, isolation, and further prosecution. Staying meant facing an armed, military-style invasion. The inmates, speaking with one voice, refused the ultimatum. They offered one last, desperate counteroffer: a peaceful release of the hostages in exchange for safe passage to a federal court, where they could present their case. The offer was rejected outright. The Observer Committee, realizing they had failed, made a painful decision. They chose to withdraw. They had done everything they could to mediate peace, but now their presence was simply delaying the inevitable attack. As they walked out, they felt the weight of the men's faces watching them, a silent, crushing sense of betrayal and abandonment. Tom Wicker would later write that walking out was the hardest thing he ever did. With the observers gone, the stage was set. Governor Rockefeller gave the final order: retake the prison by force. He argued that intelligence suggested the inmates were planning a mass execution of the hostages at 12 p.m., a claim that was later proven to be completely false, but which served as the official justification for the assault. At 9:46 a.m., a New York State Police helicopter soared over D-Yard, kicking up dust and deafening noise. State troopers, National Guardsmen, and correctional officers, many of them armed with shotguns and automatic weapons, were positioned on the parapets overlooking the yard. The waiting was over. The state was coming for its prison, and it was bringing a river of violence with it. The assault began with a sound that ripped the silence apart: a heavy roar from above. The police helicopter, flying low, began dropping tear gas canisters over D-Yard. The gas was so thick and potent that it instantly blinded and choked the men below. Imagine breathing fire while simultaneously being unable to see the person standing right next to you. The yard became a churning, panicked cloud of blue smoke. This was not just riot control. It was a military-grade chemical attack designed to neutralize and disorient the large crowd instantly. As the tear gas descended, the ground troops moved in. Hundreds of New York State troopers and correctional officers, many wearing gas masks, stormed the perimeter. This group was not just retaking a prison. They were going in with a vengeance. Many of the correctional officers were friends or colleagues of the men held hostage, and they were fueled by 4 days of fear, resentment, and the state-fed rumors of atrocities. They were carrying not just rifles and shotguns, but personal weapons, and they were ready to use them. The moment the gas hit, the inmates scattered, many trying to protect the hostages, others trying to find cover. The inmate security team, led by men like Big Black Smith, tried desperately to maintain order, but the chaos was overwhelming. This was the moment the plan disintegrated into sheer terror. The inmates' biggest leverage, the hostages, was instantly the biggest liability. What followed was a horrific, indiscriminate firing spree. The state police opened fire from the cell block roofs and the perimeter walls, aiming directly into the cloud of tear gas and smoke that filled D-Yard. They were firing at anything that moved. The order was allegedly to only shoot when absolutely necessary, but in the frenzy of gas and fear, that rule was ignored completely. Bullets ripped through the sheets and blankets that made up the inmates' makeshift tents. They tore into the concrete. Crucially, they tore into the hostages. The official line was that the inmates would be the ones to execute the hostages, but the truth was sickeningly different. It was the state's bullets that instantly killed 10 of the hostages and 29 inmates. The firing lasted only a few minutes, maybe 6 at the most, but in that short time, the yard became a slaughterhouse. In the immediate aftermath of the initial volley, the smoke began to clear, revealing a devastating scene. Bodies of inmates and hostages lay mingled in the yard. The state police quickly moved in to secure the area, but the story they immediately told the public was a lie, a shocking distortion of the facts. The state's official spokesperson, Commissioner Oswald, announced to the world that the inmates had slit the throats of the hostages. The narrative was simple and monstrous. The criminals, in a fit of savagery, had executed the innocent guards. This story was repeated endlessly by media outlets who accepted the state's account without question, solidifying the idea in the public mind that the uprising had ended in an act of pure, inmate-driven evil. The goal was clearly to justify the heavy-handed military response and to remove any sympathy the public might have had for the inmates' cause. However, the truth began to leak out almost immediately. Medics and doctors who examined the bodies, both inmates and hostages, quickly determined that the deaths were caused by high-velocity rifle and shotgun fire. There were no slit throats, no castration. The medical examiner's report confirmed the awful reality. all 10 dead hostages, and nearly all of the dead inmates, had been killed by the state police and National Guard. The men sent to rescue the hostages were the ones who had accidentally killed them, a tragic consequence of the chaotic, overly aggressive military assault. When this truth finally emerged, it was a massive blow to the credibility of Governor Rockefeller and the entire state apparatus. It proved that the government had not only used excessive force, but had also deliberately covered up their actions with a gruesome fabrication. The lie of the slit throats became a symbol of the state's willingness to sacrifice truth and lives to maintain absolute control and justify their actions. The discovery of the truth marked the beginning of a long, painful effort by activists and lawyers to hold the state accountable for the massive loss of life caused by the assault. The fighting was over, but the abuse was just beginning. The official body count in DR was 39 men dead, 29 inmates, and 10 hostages, but the violence didn't stop there. As the surviving inmates were rounded up, the atmosphere shifted from military assault to raw, personal vengeance. The correctional officers and state police involved in the retaking were now enraged, both by the death of their colleagues and by the sheer defiance of the inmates. The surviving 1,200 inmates were stripped naked, forced to crawl across the muddy, bloody yard, and then subjected to a grueling and systematic process of humiliation and torture. This was not official processing. This was an orgy of retribution. The men were beaten with clubs, fists, and boots. Cigarettes were put out on their bodies. They were forced to lie in human waste and run gauntlets of officers who simply wanted to hurt them. This went on for hours. The abuse was especially severe for the men identified as leaders, like L. D. Barkley and Frank Big Black Smith. Smith was subjected to electric shock with cattle prods and had a football placed over his genitals while officers beat it with nightsticks. The officers made it clear that the inmates had dared to challenge the system, and now they would pay the price for their brief moment of freedom. The worst part of this retribution was the forced silence. The men were forbidden to speak. If they uttered a sound, they were beaten again. They were held naked in the tunnels for days, shivering and starving, before being packed into the old isolation cells, which were already hellish. The state had won the physical battle, but in doing so, they had committed a crime arguably as terrible as any act committed during the takeover. The hope for reform that had powered the four-day stand in DR was extinguished, replaced by a cold, devastating realization. The system did not want to be reformed. It simply wanted to hurt those who tried. The stench of tear gas and death had barely cleared before the public outcry began. Once the medical examiner's report confirmed that the hostages were killed by police gunfire, not by the inmates' knives, the narrative shifted from one of heroic rescue to state tragedy and potential murder. Pressure mounted for a full, official investigation. Governor Rockefeller, attempting to manage the crisis, appointed a commission to look into the uprising and its violent end. The investigation, however, quickly became a battleground. The state police and the correctional officers presented a united front, claiming they were following orders and acting in self-defense. They destroyed key evidence, including many of the weapons used in the assault and logbooks from the day. Their narrative focused relentlessly on the initial violence of the takeover, the death of Officer Quinn, to justify their own later brutality. Meanwhile, lawyers and activists, working on behalf of the surviving inmates, began gathering their own evidence. They interviewed hundreds of men, often in secret, to document the systematic abuse and torture that occurred after the retaking. These testimonies painted a horrifying picture of state-sanctioned revenge. The inmates revealed how officers had forced them to sign statements saying the hostages had been killed by other inmates or face further beatings. The cover-up was massive and meticulously executed. Key state officials, including Governor Rockefeller, were careful to distance themselves from the specific operational decisions of the assault, but they defended the overall decision to use force. They buried reports, ignored credible witnesses, and focused on prosecuting the inmates who survived, rather than the officers who fired the deadly shots. The underlying message was clear: the state would protect its own, and anyone who questioned their authority would be made to pay. The justice system was not seeking truth. It was seeking vindication for the state's actions. After the riot, the state initiated criminal prosecutions against 62 inmates who had been identified as leaders or highly active participants in the uprising. The goal was to prove that the entire revolt was a simple criminal conspiracy, not a legitimate political protest against inhumane conditions. These prosecutions dragged on for years, costing millions of dollars and focusing public attention away from the state's own wrongdoing. In a powerful act of legal defense, the inmates' defense team, led by determined lawyers like William Kunstler, turned the trials into a courtroom challenge of the entire New York prison system. They argued that the inmates' actions were born out of absolute necessity, a desperate cry for survival against systemic abuse. They put the conditions of Attica, the racism, the lack of medical care, the brutality, on trial. This was unprecedented. For the first time, the men who had been invisible were given a voice in a public forum, detailing the precise horrors that led to the four-day takeover. The legal process was deeply biased against the inmates. Many of the alleged leaders faced charges including murder and kidnapping. However, after years of deadlock, legal maneuvers, and public scrutiny, the state began to face setbacks. Juries were becoming skeptical of the state's evidence, especially given the proven lies about the hostages' deaths. Prosecutors struggled to prove that specific inmates were responsible for the death of Officer Quinn amidst the initial chaos. Ultimately, the criminal cases against the inmates collapsed. In 1976, 5 years after the uprising, Governor Hugh Carey pardoned the few inmates who had been convicted, bringing the criminal trials to an end. This legal battle highlighted a deep moral failure. While a few inmates were punished, not a single state trooper or correctional officer was ever indicted or charged for the deaths of the 10 hostages or the 29 inmates killed in the assault, nor for the widespread torture that followed. The lack of accountability for the state's violence left a permanent scar on the survivors and their families, cementing the sense that justice was truly blind, or perhaps just unwilling to look at those in power. While the criminal justice system failed to hold the state accountable, the civil courts became the next and final battleground. The inmates and the families of the dead men filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the state of New York and several high-ranking officials, including Governor Rockefeller and Commissioner Oswald. This wasn't about putting officers in jail. It was about seeking monetary compensation and, more importantly, a public acknowledgement of the state's role in the massacre and subsequent abuse. This civil case, known as Aljundi v. Estate of Rockefeller, became one of the longest and most complex civil rights cases in American history. It dragged on for decades. The state employed every legal tactic available to stall, delay, and suppress information. They argued about jurisdiction, evidence admissibility, and the statute of limitations. For the surviving inmates, who had already endured years of prison and post-traumatic stress, the court battle was another form of relentless psychological punishment. They had to relive the horror of DR over and over again on the witness stand. The state's resistance was fierce, because an official ruling against them would mean acknowledging that the state police had committed mass violence and covered it up. However, the tenacity of the plaintiff's lawyers and the sheer weight of the evidence, including the undisputed ballistics reports and the testimonies of surviving inmates, slowly wore the state down. Finally, in 2000, nearly 30 years after the uprising, the state agreed to a settlement. The total amount paid was $12 million, distributed among over 500 former inmates and their families. While no amount of money could truly compensate for the lives lost or the trauma endured, the settlement represented the closest thing the inmates ever received to an official admission of guilt. The state agreed to the settlement not as an act of generosity, but as an end to a case they were clearly losing, one that continued to expose their darkest secrets. The monetary award was small, but the public, historical victory, forcing the state to pay for the massacre, was immense. The uprising and the subsequent massacre at Attica did not fade away. It became a defining moment in American history, leaving a deep and complicated legacy. On one hand, the horrific violence exposed the raw, systemic racism and cruelty inherent in the correctional system. Attica forced the public to look beyond the image of criminals and see men who were demanding basic human dignity. It became a rallying cry for prison reform and a foundational event for the modern prisoners' rights movement. The uprising directly led to some immediate, though small, reforms in New York's prisons. Basic quality of life improvements were made: better food, more male privileges, and slightly better medical care. More importantly, the events spurred lawyers and advocates to challenge prison conditions across the country, leading to major court rulings that established minimum constitutional standards for inmate treatment. The inmates of Attica, even in their defeat, had forced the system to grudgingly concede that prisoners retained some human rights. However, the legacy is also one of devastating failure. While the conditions slightly improved, the fundamental issues of overcrowding, racial disparity, and the use of violence as a primary means of control remained. In fact, many argue that Attica contributed to a hardening of the system. The state, embarrassed by its loss of control and the subsequent civil suits, doubled down on a tough-on-crime approach. Prisons became even more isolated, with less focus on rehabilitation and more on strict, almost military-style management. The lesson the state took from Attica wasn't be more humane, but be more secure and less vulnerable to disruption. For the survivors, the legacy was a lifetime of physical and psychological wounds. Many suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For Frank "Big Black" Smith, the leader of the security force, the trauma of the torture he endured haunted him until his death decades later. The very real fear of retribution and the profound feeling of being abandoned by the outside world when the observers left remained a constant shadow over their lives. It's crucial to remember that Attica was not just about politics and reform. It was about the 43 lives lost, the 33 men killed in the final assault, and the 10 men who died from injuries sustained during the revolt. These were fathers, sons, and brothers, both correctional officers and inmates, whose lives were swallowed by the fortress. The state initially did everything it could to differentiate between the two groups. The correctional officers were immediately deemed heroes, martyrs who died in the line of duty. Their names, like Quinn, Frizz, and Talio, were etched into monuments and official narratives. Their families received state support and public sympathy. For the 29 inmates killed by state police bullets, the story was very different. They were dismissed as criminals who got what they deserved. For years, their families were denied basic information about their deaths and received no financial or emotional support from the state. It took decades of legal battles for the names of the dead inmates to even be officially listed alongside the officers in some memorials, an acknowledgement of the shared tragedy. The memory of the men in D-Yard serves as a chilling reminder of the state's ultimate power. When the negotiation fails, when the state decides order is more important than life, the violence is overwhelming and final. The dead of Attica represent the cost of neglecting human suffering and the terrible consequence of demanding reform with no leverage other than a few hostages. They are a permanent historical marker of how America responded when its own marginalized citizens rose up and demanded to be treated as men, not animals. Their deaths forced a conversation that the powerful would have preferred to keep buried behind high stone walls. Even today, more than 50 years later, the story of Attica feels incomplete. There are still many unanswered questions and long-standing debates. Should Governor Rockefeller have gone to the prison? Could the lives of the hostages have been saved if he had shown up? Almost all historians and participants agree that his refusal to go directly caused the breakdown of the negotiations and sealed the tragic end. Perhaps the most important question is about accountability. The fact that no state official or officer was ever criminally charged for the deaths of 39 people, including 10 of their own, remains one of the most egregious examples of state impunity in modern American history. The system protected its own, sending a chilling message that the use of lethal force by agents of the state, even if reckless, would not be punished. Attica is not just a story about a riot. It's a story about power. It's about who gets to decide who is human and who is disposable. It's about the struggle for civil rights reaching the most isolated, concrete corners of the nation. It stands as a monument to the failure of diplomacy, the power of propaganda, and the devastating consequences of systemic neglect. The spirit of rebellion that sparked the 4-day stand in D-Yard, the demand for dignity, still echoes in the prison reform movements of today. The prison walls still stand. The system is still struggling, and the memory of the men who stood up in 1971 continues to push America to confront the uncomfortable, brutal truth about its own justice system. The story of Attica is not over, because the fight for true justice continues. The sound of Attica, that distant clang and the final terrible echo of gunfire reminds us that justice is not always served, and history is often written in blood. 4 days of hope and defiance ended in a massacre, leaving a scar on the American conscience that has never truly healed. The men in D-Yard asked for dignity and were met with overwhelming violence. What do you think was the biggest failure at Attica? The state's refusal to negotiate, or the systemic racism that created the conditions for the revolt in the first place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more forgotten histories, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember the story of Attica.